We're joined today by Berwood Yost, director of the Floyd Institute for Opinion Research at Franklin and Marshall College. We're about to look at some of the data from the latest poll release. However, before we get into specifics, I just want to note that this poll was conducted just weeks after the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, as well as shortly after President Biden's withdrawal from the race. Did that give you any expectations or any thoughts of what might happen as you began to conduct the poll?
Well, I think there was some information coming from some other polls that were slowly trickling out after Kamala Harris assumed the Democratic top of the ticket on the Democratic ticket. She was certainly looked like there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm. Other polls were starting to show that nationally. So when we looked at this data, and we saw where the race is and how it's shaping up, I think it fell into pretty close alignment with our expectations in terms of where she was at nationally, the kind of enthusiasm we were seeing from voters for her candidacy, and actually even a slight bump for former President Trump in his numbers. So there's a lot going on here, as you said. Whether it was the assassination attempt, the Republican convention, the withdrawal of President Biden, all of those things could have led us to a lot of different places. But I think we landed somewhere that is pretty consistent with the sorts of things we're seeing more broadly and more nationally.
The first question we'll look at, are you better or worse off financially than a year ago? 16% say better off, 47% say worse off, 36% the same, and don't know comes in at 1%. So the first question, 47% say that they're worse off than a year ago. How does this compare to previous polls?
So, this is interesting. I think there's a general sentiment. If you characterized the sentiment in the poll, it's still a bit more negative than positive, but there are signs that sort of expectations for the future are becoming more positive. And so, there's still far more people, for instance, who think that their personal financial circumstances are worse than a year ago. Those numbers are really bad. But the number of people who said, I think I'll be better off next year, that's increased. And so I think there's some if you look at the kind of overall mood of voters right now, you sort of see this pessimism, but it seems to be turning a corner where maybe in the next poll or soon after, we'll start to see more positive feelings. But when we analyze some of those indicators, financial circumstances, the ratings of the incumbent president, those things are all at a level that are really a problem for Democratic candidates. Even though this poll shows Kamala Harris ahead of Donald Trump slightly in the state, certainly within the margin of error, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. The reality is there are red flags if I'm a Democratic candidate that I'd be concerned about it. And at the top of that list, how people feel about their finances, how they feel about the job Biden has done, and how many of them are basically concerned about the economy, and that's going to be what they're voting about.
Did you notice, is there a partisan breakdown dividing those who felt better or worse about their financial situation?
Yeah, as you might expect, there were more Republicans and independents than Democrats feeling worse off than a year ago. But still, there's a sizable number of independent voters. There's a sizable number of Democrats, something like a quarter or more, who say they're worse off than a year ago. So this sort of general negative economic assessment is pretty widespread. And while it's bigger in some parties than the others, it's felt across the parties.
And the next question we'll look at is Pennsylvania headed in the right direction or on the wrong track? 43% say it's headed in the right direction, 47% the wrong track, 10% don't know. Once again, perhaps following a similar theme, are you noticing signs of optimism for the future?
Yes, again, so we see those numbers are still more negative than positive, but The number of people who are talking about the state heading in the right direction is, I think, as high as it's been since the 2020 election. And so, again, generally negative, but slightly turning up in terms of optimism for the future. We'll follow that one closely because those numbers have been really poor. And in part of the reasons that the president and his job approval are so low is that people really feel their financial circumstances are bad and the direction of the state and the country isn't great. And so those are important indicators to keep an eye on.
The next question looks at the most important issues facing the state. I'll just read the top three. The economy came in at 23%, government and politicians at 11%, and education at 10%. Have you seen much fluctuation as to what issues were ranking highest among respondents?
Yeah, in fact, there are a couple of categories that we put together to indicate concern about the economy. And so that number is actually even a bit higher. It's probably closer to a third. And that's been the case for several years now. The economy has been everyone's top concern for a long time. It hasn't fallen back really. So I think that's one of the top of mind issues it's really going to be driving this election as it continues.
Are you surprised that abortion didn't rank higher in the top three issues? Is this a sign that perhaps the impact of the Dobbs decision is starting to wear off?
I think this is much like what we saw in 2022, because when we asked that top of mind question about what's the biggest problem, economy was at the top of the list, and abortion and abortion access didn't make the top 4 or 5 topics that people were concerned about. But when you ask people about their vote choices, we saw a much closer split between concerns about the economy and concerns about abortion rights. And I think that's true in this poll as well. When you look at the reasons that people provide for supporting Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, we see a real difference there, particularly around the economy and the abortion rights.
So our next question asks, do you favor open primary elections? 77% of registered voters favor open primary elections that allow registered independent voters to participate in the primary of their choice. Can you talk a little bit about what you see perhaps as potential impacts? For example, would this affect party registration moving forward?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question. I mean, whenever we ask questions about electoral reform, we see a lot of support among voters. They're interested in all kinds of reforms. And so I don't think the numbers here surprised me. There's general support for this kind of change. And in fact, to answer your question specifically, we did ask people if they could vote in a primary of their choice, if they were registered as an independent, would they change their party? And a sizable portion, I think roughly a third or so, said they would think about changing. And so, the notion of having open primaries where independents can choose where they vote is highly popular. And I suspect that it would cause some people to change their party registration in the future, probably because it would give them the opportunity to vote in the most competitive primaries whenever they arise. And so interesting finding for sure.
Let's look now at Governor Josh Shapiro's job approval rating. 51% rated him as excellent or good. 40% fair or poor, 9% don't know. The timing of this poll is important. It was conducted from July 31st through August 11th. That includes spanning the time where Governor Josh Shapiro was considered a potential VP pick to the time where Kamala Harris picked someone else. Do you think that had any influence on some of the respondents to this question?
Governor Shapiro's job approval ratings have stayed pretty consistent. Once they sort of rose after the I-95 highway collapse, and they had a successful response to that. His numbers increased pretty positively, and they have stayed there. And even through the recent conversation about him potentially being vice president, we didn't see his numbers move much at all. He is still as popular a first-term governor as we have had at this point in their first term since Tom Ridge in the mid-90s. And really, Francine, this could have gone either way for the governor. I mean, this is a highly partisan sort of thing, being considered as at the top of the ticket for your party. It could have reminded some voters, independents and Republicans, about his partisanship, about what he stands for, and it could have caused some of them to rethink their feelings about how he does his job. Clearly, that didn't happen. So, on balance, it just looks like Pennsylvanians have judged his performance. They continue to think it's positive.
Let's look now at job approval rating for President Joe Biden. 35% say excellent or good, 64% fair or poor. Did President Biden's withdrawal from the election do anything to change public perception of him?
Yeah, really, his numbers have also stayed pretty consistent. Now, we didn't ask about the favorability ratings, which we have in the past. I suspect they may have ticked up a little bit, but his job approval rating is basically negative. And as I said earlier, that's a big potential drag on the Harris-Walz ticket because people really aren't positive about the way he's done his job. Those numbers haven't improved, at least here in this state, since he dropped out. We'll see as the campaign continues, and we know that the Harris-Walz ticket is going to have to talk about the Biden administration, their policies, where they're similar, where they're different. So maybe some of those numbers will change, but at the moment, things have stayed pretty consistent.
The next question looks at the presidential race. Harris comes in at 46%, Trump at 43%. And then as we look at some of the third-party candidates, RFK at 6%, Jill Stein at 1%, Chase Oliver at 1%, and Don't Know at 3%. Can you talk a little bit about, you had mentioned an enthusiasm gap before among Democrats. Do you think that this is still reflective of a honeymoon period, or do you expect these numbers to look consistent as we get closer to November?
That's a good question. And she still has sort of honeymoon-like things coming up with the Democratic National Convention. So this wave that she's riding could be sustained for a little bit. It's hard to know because we're operating in uncharted territory here. But I think there has been a real change in the race. I mean, we know that Democrats are now as enthusiastic about the campaign and about voting as Republicans are. That wasn't true earlier in the cycle before President Biden dropped out. We've also seen that the Democratic voters who supported President Biden in 2020 have sort of come back to the ticket now. And so when you look at progressives and liberals, when you look at younger voters, those voters they're supporting Kamala Harris in greater numbers than they were supporting Joe Biden. And that's really what accounts for her lead here. Part of that is sort of the way Robert Kennedy's candidacy has sunk. I mean, he's probably half where he was in previous polls. He's had a rough couple of weeks. But part of it is also the Democratic base coming back. And so that's what we're seeing here. Something I'm keeping an eye on, though, her performance among, I think, moderates and older voters is not quite as good as President Biden's was. So although the base has come back, some of those other voters are still making up their mind about her. So if there is a honeymoon period, we should look to those voters to see if that changes, right? I'm not sure that it will because there's been a lot going on so far. But let's face it, there's a lot of advertising to take place yet in this campaign. And if there's a consistent weakness for the Democrats, it's around the economy. Even in this poll, more people think former President Trump can handle the economy than she can. So she's going to have a good message about that, or I think we could see her numbers sink.
Do you think that there's any threat the third-party candidates can still act as a spoiler, or did they lose their significance in the recent weeks?
Look, whenever you have 5 candidates on the ballot, any portion of the vote that doesn't go to someone at the top of the ticket could serve as a spoiler when you have a state that's decided so closely as it has been the last few elections. But I think the importance of third-party candidates has probably declined a bit because we no longer have the circumstance we had before Biden dropped out, which is that about 20% of voters didn't like either Trump or Biden. So you may have heard people refer to them as the double haters. I didn't like that term, but let's go with it since it's common. The number of those double haters has declined. It's less than half that it was. And so since you don't have so many people dissatisfied with both candidates, the appeal of third-party candidates is low.
I'd like to look at two sets of responses back to back. Now, first of all, top reasons voters support Kamala Harris. The top three include anti-Trumpism, women's rights, and character, compared to top reasons that voters support Donald Trump. Those are economic policies, immigration, and partisanship. Do you think that these issues are important to specific voting blocks? Have they been consistent throughout polling in recent months, or does that fluctuate as well?
Well, we've only just started asking the reasons for the support question. So I'm not sure how much they've changed recently, but the patterns we see here are very similar to the patterns we've seen in prior elections. Republicans more likely to be voting on issues like the economy and immigration. Democrats more likely to be concerned about abortion rights and democracy in general. So I think it is somewhat consistent. The question is, at the end of the day, what are the people who aren't sure how they're going to vote or are still making up their mind? Which of those issues is going to rise to the top for them? Because that ultimately will decide who wins, I think.
Let's look now at the U.S. Senate race. Bob Casey, the incumbent, coming in at 48%. Dave McCormick, the Republican, at 36%. Someone else, 3%. Don't know, 13%. You talked earlier about the importance of the economy as an issue that might threaten the presidential race. Do you think that has the same impact on this race?
Well, I think up and down the ticket, it's an important part of the context of this election. But there are other things that are important too. And, I think the thing that's most interesting about the Casey McCormick race is that we've actually seen McCormick lose some support among not just independent voters, but even among some Republican constituencies. And I think in part that's because Senator Casey's advertising related to issues around China and out-of-state residency and McCormick's job as a hedge fund manager. I think some of those have resonated with some members of the Republican base who have concerns about internationalism, China in particular. I think that's been part of the reason that Senator Casey has been able to sort of advance his lead a little bit, certainly lead more comfortably than Harris's over Trump. But I would say on the other side of this, if McCormick can find his footing and find an effective counter message, there are a lot of Republicans who are still making up their mind. I think it's more likely than not that they're going to come back and vote for him on election day.
I'd look at two pieces of data back to back once again. This one regarding the Senate race. Top reasons voters support Casey. Those are partisanship, honesty, and women's rights. And top reasons why voters support Dave McCormick: partisanship, economic policy, and honesty. Do you see parallels between why voters might support a particular U.S. Senate candidate compared to why they might support a particular presidential candidate?
Yeah, there are. You heard the economy and women's rights come up here as you would expect them to, consistent with what we saw with the presidential candidates. But there are differences. People are much more likely for these Senate candidates to suggest some specific policy or partisan issue that drives their vote. So in some ways, the Senate candidates, until they're better known, particularly in McCormick's case, I think something like a third of voters don't know enough about him to have an opinion about him, and that's part of why he's trailing. I think those partisanship issues will drive some of this vote at the end of the day. But they're consistent with what we're seeing at the top of the ticket. I think the the thing that's important for the Senate candidates is for them to be able to distinguish themselves from the top of the ticket. I think Senator Casey's experience in this state and his record allow him to do that. I think Dave McCormick is still working to do that.
Do you have any sense of who remains undecided?
You know, that's a good question. We won't really be digging into those numbers until closer to Election Day, because we suspect there's still some people who aren't paying attention. In fact, we know that from some of the other numbers in our poll. We know that something like maybe 90% of the people in these races who've chosen a candidate probably won't change. There's still a lot of people that potentially could change their mind, even if they're leaning to a candidate at the moment. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see what drives them. But at the moment, we don't have a clear picture of exactly who the undecided voters are. I mean, if I had to guess, they're a little more likely to be registered as independent. They're a little less attuned to the campaign. They're a little younger. Those are the kind of characteristics normally associated with that. But we'll follow that as we get closer to Election Day.
Berwood Yost, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Francine.